Okay, welcome everyone to the Advancing Capacity for Systemic Innovation at Scale. We're going to sort of ask ourselves questions about, where are we at and where do we need to be to address the kinds of change and the impact that the Open Climate Collabathon is aspiring to, and that we're all working on in our different communities and different collaborations that we're hoping to discover through the course of the event. My name's Tim. I joined the Collabathon from Sensorica as one of the co-organizers, and I'm going to be in a moment introducing Daniel and Stephen, who will I'll let them introduce themselves and tell their story. But just a bit of a motivation for what brings us together to on this topic in particular. At Sensorica Open Value Network and the Canadian Academy for the Knowledge Economy, working with Tiberius, we're innovating on different kinds of economic systems and ways to sort of unpack value and allow people to introduce new concepts of how they themselves conceive of the value in their projects, how they want to award contributors in different ways that expand beyond just the straightforward default monetary systems and existing economic flows. And that's been quite a complex process. The Climate Change Coalition was a group that Sensorica got involved in. They ultimately introduced us to, I think, is there another slide there, Daniel? All right, yeah, so the Sensorica joined the Climate Change Coalition, and Tom Bauman introduced us to Martine, and we became involved in the Open Climate Collabathon, and later the Hyperledger Climate Action and Accounting Special Interest Group that Martine and Tom lead. And then over the course of the past year, since the first event I participated in last November, Tiberius, Martine, Bonnie, Noah, Jacob, Luca, and many others over the weeks and months over the course of the year have been developing this Collabathon format that we're experiencing this month. And between the Sensorica work, the Climate Change Coalition, climate change itself as a problem domain, the Open Climate Collabathon organizing, and what have you, each one of these endeavors has entailed immense complexity. We had to face a lot of questions of organizing teams and online platforms and tools, and then in the process trying to conceive of how to address climate change and what kinds of technologies we can bring to bear on it. So we kind of use the phrase systemic innovation to try to capture all of that kind of effort. And so some of the key topics that come up constantly in this process, there are different communities, the whole variety of communities that come together. And then some of the new ideas we're going to talk about in this session are around notions of embodiment and this kind of thing. And a lot of how some of those principles that Stephen and Daniel will share with us can perhaps contribute to increasing our capacity to deal with this complexity of systemic innovation. But we also need to address the issues of accessibility, how to onboard people. So we pay a lot of attention to the processes of onboarding onto the digital platforms, but then there's onboarding into sort of the sociality of the different communities and the different cultures. This is a global effort. There's a lot of intercultural learning that needs to happen to achieve the kind of collaboration we want. So I think maybe the next slide there. Yeah, so weaving all of these different groups and collaborations together to try to realize this capacity for what we're calling in the Collabathon radical collaboration. It sort of compounds complexity upon complexity. And it all seems quite impossible sometimes. For instance, if you look at the Open Climate Project and the organization of domains and prompts that we're dealing with, it's an expansive landscape or reference architecture, what have you, however you conceive of it, that we're asking people to come together and work together around to build some of these components and interoperable systems and protocols and platforms using blockchain and IoT and artificial intelligence and all sorts of complex technologies to try to address so many complex issues around in regions around the world. So it's really a compounding of complexity upon complexity. Um, and a lot of times words aren't enough, language isn't enough. We talk past each other, and I think probably a lot of people have experienced this kind of challenge. And I've personally observed that engagement in creative and artistic work can help to unlock some potentials that gives us new approaches for dealing with this kind of complexity. I want to advance the slide there. Yeah, so so those are some of the reasons that I was attracted to the kinds of explorations that Stephen and Daniel have undertaken. And this session is just an invitation to explore what they have to offer for helping us answer questions around like how can we engage with diverse stakeholders. Different people have different disciplines. Sometimes we're working in small groups. Sometimes we're trying to communicate to large groups. And how can we model complexity in teams? So the complexity of working with the team, but also the trying to make decisions around complex information architectures like the Open Climate Project domains and prompts architecture, or the maps that we try to create. And Tiberius, I think, in one of the shows, one of the videos he made yesterday, was trying to show how certain graph illustrations can help us deal with the complexity of what kind of interactions people are engaging in the Collabathon. So with that, I'll just invite Daniel and Stephen to introduce themselves.
Sure. I'll introduce myself and background a bit more during my talk, but I'm Daniel Friedman, and I'm a postdoctoral researcher in Davis, California, in America. Stephen?
Hello, I'm Stephen Sillett. I'm based in Toronto. I co-founded an organization called Aid in Dramatic Change and Development. So we do a lot of international development and community development using immersive practices. And I'm doing a practice-based PhD at the moment into my practice through Canterbury Christ Church University. And I'll speak more in my talk too.
Cool. Well, I think we can just continue with it. I will be speaking for about 20 minutes. Everyone, this talk is called Enabling Emergence in Online Teams. It is November 18th, 2020. I'm Daniel Friedman, and as stated, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in California. And I'd like to just sort of jump in with that radical collaboration mindset that Tim raised just a few minutes ago, and just welcome and appreciate everybody who's here with us synchronously. Thanks for making the time to be here. And also those who are watching asynchronously, we appreciate your attention to the replay, because you're still part of these projects and community, and it's not every time zone that can participate on especially short notice. And I hope to be talking about some cool topics today, also providing some actionable insights, and also keeping in mind that it's only going to be a couple of minutes and the discussion will continue. The big question that I want to get at today is, how can complexity provide a helpful framework for approaching climate as well as climate action? And we're going to be approaching this question in the short time that we have together today by addressing the three real keywords or the pillars of the event, which are community, embodiment, and accessibility. And today, or if only for the next few minutes, let's think about complexity as our starting point and something that we can build upon, not an endpoint. So it's not going to be what is complexity. We're not going to justify that the system is complex and then equate that with being intractable. We're going to look at complexity like a doorway that we can enter into and grow and have impact within. And in the preparation for this event, which was really fun, and also thanks so much to the organizers and to Tim for working with me and with us on this event, I was able to read a recent blog post by Tim. And there's just a few short quotes that really stood out to me. One was, "It's not a question of whether, but of how and how fast to negotiate an available path along which to transform our economic metabolism into resilience and sustainability." And then slightly later, he wrote, "Our proposals for open, transparent, and richly internetworked ways of doing science and society are not so much ideological as they are realistic and practical. Advanced preparation in accelerating our resolution of grand challenges is not an ideology, it is a necessity." So that just really resonated with me, the work I've been doing, as well as ideas like anticipatory design science by Buckminster Fuller. Let's get to what we are here today to talk about, which is climate and complexity. And the climate is a complex system. Climate action is a complex problem. This is what we've been talking about. Let's go deeper into that as our starting point. So both climate as well as climate action entail multi-scale, dynamical, nonlinear, and feedback processes and systems. So whether it's weather patterns that are exchanging air molecules with each other or people who are exchanging information, there is really a lot to be said about how it would be beneficial to have a framework that could cover that whole spectrum. And another similarity between climate action and climate and complexity is that we know that we're dealing with transdisciplinary systems, so systems that move beyond being encompassed by a single disciplinary's approach to research. And we know that that entails diverse teams, and that means not just geographical representation, but also many perspectives that people bring to the table. Again, there's so much that could be said here. These are just sort of to get the juices flowing. The real similarity between climate and climate action that I want to go into on this slide is chaos. So chaos, like complexity, for many people, it's the end point. Oh, it's a chaotic system, might as well give up, book is over. But for a complexity scientist, chaos is actually a cool thing to go into. Chaos is mathematically defined as a system where small changes can have large and nonlinear impacts in the future. So it sounds awesome, sounds like climate action. Maybe there's only small things that we could start doing today that get us on that trajectory to impact that was in Tim's article and on all of our minds. And to go one more layer into the actual complexity science of this, on the right side is a figure from Lorenz, who was an American climate scientist in the middle of the 1900s. And the printout is actually from Lorenz himself. And on the left side is a idealized version of the underlying system of equations that relates to this image at right. So they're kind of two representations of a similar idea. That's also a common idea in complexity, multiple representations. And what Lorenz was studying was deterministic, so that means not stochastic, but nonlinear dynamical systems. So deterministic means that the system's behavior is defined by its state at a previous moment, and nonlinear basically means it's not linear. We'll kind of return to that soon. And what Lorenz found was that some systems are chaotic, which means that small changes in their initial conditions can lead to radically diverging outcomes. So this graph on the right, it shows that if you start two different trajectories at 76.8 or 76.853, so infinitesimally close for sure. Initially, they're totally synchronized. Then they're loosely coupled or almost resembling each other, and then they totally desync. So this is going to take us back to this idea that maybe there's small things that we could do today that even if they don't initially look like a ton is happening, in the future, they might be very important. That's like this scaling idea. And that provides an example about how complexity helps us deal with these challenges like climate and climate action in a growth mindset, rather than thinking that because it's chaotic or because it's complex, we have to get shut down. So in terms of climate action, let's be realistic. It's a big problem. There's a lot that needs to be done, but also if we can potentially do it right, we might have to make small changes now that at the very least put us on a trajectory to accomplish more in the future. That reminds me of Bucky Fuller's gravestone, which merely said, "Call me trim tab," which is the little rudder on the rudder. So we want to think about how the small changes to dynamical processes and already complex systems, what are these changes we can make today, and how do we design for that? That's everything that we're going to be talking about today. So we go to the first of the keywords that we want to get to is community. Community means so much. Again, there's so much to say, but for me, community is about community of practice. It's about community of norms, behavioral norms. It's about community of attention and shared attention, shared information. And the experience that I've been having over the last several years that was sort of silently or in the background resonating with the Collabathon is the community of practice of Complexity Weekend. And Complexity Weekend is a complexity science-based hackathon with many similarities to what is happening here, many differences as well. We had an in-person event in San Francisco in 2019. And then in 2020, we've had two all online hackathons in May and in October. We also do monthly renewal and heartbeat events, and we just always are in this sort of strange loop of trying to learn about complex systems and think about how to apply those to our own community. The question that we find ourselves asking of many, but the one that can be fit on this slide and in red text is, how can we catalyze multi-scale agency, as well as relational thinking, diverse collaborations, growth, impact and innovation, etc., and to really enmesh that complexity science perspective at the multi-scale by thinking about individuals. That's the level who we're communicating with. Now, yes, they have organs and those are composed of cells, and you could keep on going down all the way to quantum, and we have people who will go there with you, but we stop at the individual as a coarse graining, even though it comes into play. And so this is about being realistic about multi-scale systems and recognizing that there's a continuum, and then biting off what you can chew. The individual's agency, their affordances, what they can actually do is related to their relationships that they form and the mindfulness that they bring to the relationships they have. Slightly above the level of a relationship is the small team or the medium-sized team, which engages totally new dynamics. There's conversations between A and B and C, and then A and C don't work, or the three do work. So of course, there's a whole level of emergence as we scale up to the team. There's the community of norms, attention, practices, learning, whatever it may be. And that community is composed of individuals that might not be directly connected or on teams that are working on non-overlapping projects, but community needs to maintain coherence again, and that's a different kind of coherence. And then the last level where we're going to bite off is the ecosystem, which is purposefully broad. We have the social ecosystem. There's also, of course, our actual ecosystem in our niche. So we're all grounded in this shared environment that we live in. But at the relational level of our community, we can think about bridges, for example, to other communities, and just appreciate the organizations that we're able to interact with through events like this. And just a few memes/themes from Complexity Weekend. One is we want to get individuals onto small teams, and we want to help small teams have impact. So if a participant or a facilitator is not on a team, they have one objective: to get on a team. And then once somebody's on a team with an embedded facilitator, hopefully, the only meme is, how are we going to have impact? So this is sort of a, where are we? And everybody at different stages in their learning and service journey is going to be able to tap into those memes to relate to where they can actually make an improvement to the system. We've also had many discussions about hardware and software choices and little blips, and I'm sure everyone has too, #2020, and maybe that's a conversation for another day. All I'd say about hardware and software and community at this moment is that even if only linguistically, if not at a much deeper level, it's always important to connect tech, which is the how, to the mission, values, and social community, which is the why. So, hey, everyone, post an introduction in this Slack channel because of the community. Or here's the community, that's the big why. How are we going to do that? What's the link? What's the call to action? And so to relate even within the same sentence, the how and the why is very powerful for engaging a lot of different kinds of stakeholders. And with my colleague, Richard Corday, we've also worked a little bit on some of the platform implementation, analytic backend, and also narratives and memetics related to these kinds of infinite research communities. The second topic to talk about is embodiment. And again, there's so many angles on what embodiment means. I've learned so much from engaging with Stephen. There are just so many aspects to embodiment, and it will be great to hear in the breakouts and in our subsequent events how participants really take this on, because this is about our lived experience. But I'm going to take the question or the notion of embodiment in the direction of embedded action. And my question or my motivator is, how do we plan and design for stigmergy? So I loved in listening to some previous videos by these participants to hear about stigmergy as a theme, a recurrent idea. Stigmergy is a word that comes from the termite literature in 1959 to describe agent-based or sort of autonomous systems where there's a feedback between agents and their local environment. And agents modify their environment, and then by perceiving their environment, it modifies the likelihood of them participating in certain future behavior. So you pick up a pebble with some probability, you drop it with increased probability next to another pebble, and that modifies the likelihood that that ant or termite is going to drop off a pebble, but also that another one might. So there's this like interacting with yourself through time aspect of stigmergy, as well as the collective behavioral dynamic. And what I love about this image, which is from the ant species I studied for my PhD. It's a harvester ant species in Southeast Arizona called Pogonomyrmex barbatus, red harvester ant. And this image captures like two extreme modes of stigmergy, if you will. So on the right side of the image is a bunch of ants who are carrying a beetle back to their nest together. Now, most of the time, this species is actually doing solo foraging missions for seeds. But once in a while, there's something that's just too good or too big for one ant to carry back. And that's when they actually engage this dynamic and emergent mode of collaboration. And so their evolutionary endowment is the flexibility to move between autonomous or more autonomous, let's say, and very rapid, instantaneous formation of these emergent teams that may not immediately know exactly what their mission is or what their direction is. So it's very dynamic, and it takes advantage of cues that are already in the environment, like the smell of a dead beetle. On the left side of the image, and it's almost so small you might not see it, but it's actually the nest entrance. It's where the ants are circling around. And this species of ant, red harvester ant, they have a single queen, and she can live up to 30 or more years. Yet the workers live less than a year, and they never relocate nests, or should I say very rarely. Most of the time, they live in the same nest for their whole life. So you have the soma, the ants that are always turning over. There's this churn of participants, of foragers, of workers, of different roles, tasks in the colony. But then there's this very long decade scale, larger spatial and temporal expanses of collaboration, the embedding, the architecture, the stigmergy in the constructed niche. So this is the other extreme. There's the dynamic beetle. We got to get this opportunity right now. And then there's the nest. We're going to protect this nest, and we're going to make it strong. And how do we make that kind of stigmergy happen in a world that feels like we're in a lucid dream related to office space? I don't know. Everyone has a different experience, right? But it's not this way. So there's so much to say here, but all I'd say is we can look to high reliability organizations and the idea of operation orders or op-ords, specifically facilitating op-ords that allow projects to evolve in terms of their narrative, methods, the team composition, the approach. We need to find emergent compromises between bottom-up and top-down decision-making. That is what is going to allow adaptation. It's also what's going to allow for information propagation and feelings of ownership and belonging, which just cannot be short-circuited in these kinds of systems. I'd encourage people to think inclusively in terms of open source, citizen, participatory projects, which means that communication and memetics has to be designed to meet people wherever they're at in terms of the education, the preferences, and the fluency with different platforms. And the media is the message. So the embodied, enacted experience of community participants is going to be variable, and we can't put ourselves exactly in every single person's shoe. So how are we going to design for that? Let's answer that by talking about accessibility. Many angles on accessibility, but the way that I'll inroad it is with this idea of a participant's journey. And that's their connection, their learning, their participation in different events, as well as their impact on different projects. But people come in at so many different places, there's so many different paths on the landscape that the participant's journey is something that's always unique. And to phrase the participant's journey as this embodied, dynamical process, we can think about stages and archetypes and checkpoints, but not necessarily goals or metrics, but things that we do want to understand for a few reasons. It will allow us to be specific with successes and failures so that we make sure that everyone is included and so that we make sure that no one falls between the cracks. And then also, it allows us to basically, from an organizer's perspective, scale better because we can include more people with more automation, with better tools. There's so many other aspects. To give a few of these checkpoints that the dynamical participant should hurtle through and enjoy, and then look back and mentor other participants at different parts in their journey, we can think about onboarding. How do you reach out to people? Who are the latent communities that will help with climate action? What are the technology and tools that will facilitate them? Whether it's a mobile connection with spotty internet, or it's somebody with high-speed internet and a programming background and many monitors, et cetera. How are we going to institute behavioral norms and narratives that are inclusive and that welcome people? How will we help participants build edge relationships? So not hub and spoke, everybody knows the organizer, they're a cool person, but edges. and the long-term intercultural and also importantly intergenerational connections that stabilize and give coherence to a community. What are the teams? How will we get participants on teams? Up until this stage, the only meme they need to think about is how do I get onto a team? But how will we make those teams inclusive, dynamic, project-oriented and role-based, yet not overly prescriptive or overly focused on metrics? How will we raise up peer-to-peer mentorship? And then how do we, in a virtuous spiral, lead participants to making impact in the real world through team projects? That means everyone's going to be playing a different special role. Everyone is respected because they're all going to be part of functional teams. How can we also have team performance with this emphasis on an individuated learning journey, and especially a learning journey that might include the encounter with the unexpected or the unknown, because there's so much to learn in our complexity journey or in our climate journey. And just one further resource for people who want to learn more. This is with some colleagues, including Richard, but also several others related to active inference and behavioral engineering for teams. This is an area there's many offshoots of, and Stephen, it's been great to engage with you on these topics. But in this paper, we go into a bit more detail on the ontologies, narratives, formal documents, and tools that could facilitate these kinds of accessible systems. That's basically it for what I wanted to talk about. So I wanted to bring it back to the title of the event, which is Advancing Capacity. And capacity isn't just the size of a gas tank or a water bottle. It's about our capacity for resilience, for regeneration, our capacity to include, our capacity to design. So these are not things that are filled up. These are things that we develop and catalyze and advance. That's why we named the event this way. And these are the kinds of topics that we want to engage with people on. If I could conclude with just the takeaways of what I'd want to see implemented in terms of advancing capacity, the first would be a broadly understood complexity mindset. It's going to look 1,000 different ways for 1,000 different people, but let's keep complexity in mind and keep it in mind as a beginning point, not a shutdown for discussions. Let's learn by doing. Let's draw on knowledge traditions and practice traditions that are well established, and let's learn from each other. Let's learn from each other's perspectives on different questions, hear the beginner's question in the expert room, because it's the beginner's question that can actually have the project move in a way it wouldn't have moved. So who is really the expert in that room? And is that even a helpful framing? And then lastly, bring it back to community, because we're people, we're embodied, and we need to make it about the people and about the world, because if it spirals off into abstraction, we will not be moving towards action. If we can return it to things that everybody has experience with, like community, their own experience, and accessibility, we're going to be in a really good spot to scale, which is the goal of this talk and session. And with that being said, in the breakout sessions and the kinds of questions that we want to be catalyzing discussion around, for a first breakout session, something you could do with yourself in the mirror, something you can do with your friend on a different video chat, whether you're watching it live or in replay, would be how do we apply complexity in real situations and how do we connect to complexity? And then how do we think about climate action from a complexity perspective and think about the nonlinear changes that we could implement in the system today? These are the kinds of upward looking and motivating questions that are just always a fount of discussion with other collaborators. And then a second set of questions for another mirror, another video call, another friend, another edge in the network would be, how can we do more with less? That's so critical because there is not always enough of the right type of resource at the moment. And how can we do more with less? By having active communities and inclusive projects, because people are always surprised with what they can get done when they ask themselves what they can get done. And secondly, what platforms, skills, and collaborations might be needed for you to take your work to the next level. And if you don't know, that's fine, because in that case, maybe what you're looking for is a mentor or a guide, somebody who can say, wow, you're having so many cool ideas about math. There's a class on that, or there's a group that's working on that, or there's a project that's actually already formed around that. And so how are we going to intertwine a complex systems way of viewing the world with the reality on the ground, in the air, and in the sea, with the social reality and the economic realities that we're all embedded within. So thanks for the attention to the live part and to everybody watching it in replay. It's really been an honor to participate in this Collabathon. Really looking forward to it. And I'll look forward to the continued discussions. So I will unshare my screen and pass it to Stephen. But again, thanks a lot, everyone. And Stephen, please. I need to.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, that was really, really interesting, Daniel, and lots of stuff to chew on, and lots of things for me to try and weave some connections to in my talk as well. And I'm just going to share my screen here. So yeah, so as was mentioned there, we've been talking a lot and discussing how we can get from this, say, false sense of certainty in the world that has kind of plagued to bringing in complexity, and how that complexity is present. I'm going to be talking about something in the similar domain, but about community-based and embedded teams. So really getting very, very immersed into a context. And can we connect and perform impactfully together? And when I say together, I'm really going to be radical in terms of how many different types of actors we might want to engage. So how can we connect and perform impactfully together across levels, types of climate action, and across varieties of niche? Because we've got a whole range of things that are going on in the world, and they need to be somehow more configured together. So I'm going to be speaking, my name's Stephen Sillett. I'm a practice-based PhD student looking at some psychological perspectives on my professional practice, which is partly what I'm going to be sharing. The organisation that I founded was called Aid in Dramatic Change in Development, or ADSID, as you can see on the right there. And in that work, and as that evolved, it also tied into an interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary research lab that we developed called Infusion Lab, and some processes there. So, but the general questions that have come up, I'm going to be sort of looking at those and seeing as well how there's hopefully raising new questions, and also maybe looking for ways that Daniel's work and with complexity and larger teams can connect to some of this work here. So one of the things that I'm going to just bring to the table is the idea of really zooming right out and say, thinking of community as a sense of community. Okay, so community can be present and we can feel it when it's there at different levels of interaction. And I'm going to start to bring in, what does it mean to actually engage at these different levels? What's the impact, particularly on scaling of international development work, where we're trying to connect with communities in areas of Africa potentially and other places to be part of the processes we're looking at. So we have our sense of community. So there needs to be an ongoing intersubjective dynamic to feel that sense of community. Okay, we can be a group, we can be assigned to a group, but it's not just a semantic representation. For the community part to be present, it will be something that is within that. So it may be that there's some shared unity of identity. And I'm going to identify three sort of broad areas that actually relates back to how we actually embody ourselves in the world. So we have the kind of high level thinking, which is often what we think about when we're talking about scaling or at scale and systemic work, or the ways. So these are the strategies within a domain of discipline. So, you know, in climate science, we have the IPCC. I put here the IDRC, the International Development Research Council, is the sort of big player in Canada, but you've got USAID, you've got also other organizations that are working with universities and institutions to sort of get this high level thinking, and that's important. And there will be community forming there at times, and to interact and engage with ideas. And we also, though, have the organisational taskscapes that coordinates action in fields of practice. And this is a big area in how projects get implemented with communities or in service design. But it is a layer that can extend in so many areas. You could say that there's organisations for manufacturing, there's organisations for all sorts of major impacts on how our world is performed. They often are reporting into or taking recommendations from the official bodies. But we also have the living area, the land-based, deeper existential knowing of what it is to be and to have experience in a landscape, in a community. And this area here, just like a lot of the sort of false sense of knowing and thinking that we know everything, is being challenged and needs to be challenged by the complexity work. The complexity can suddenly be seen as being so great once you get into this area, we almost start to revert to panpsychism. And I do a lot of work with communities through participatory workshops, through participatory arts, and sometimes it's some sort of, the artist just does their thing. But this is also an area where we need to be able to integrate, find some way to bridge and get some unifying approaches. And actually the principles of something called active inference, the dynamical systems approach that Daniel mentioned briefly there, and that we're both part of that community of what you could call exploring the discipline and using it in practice, can help to work across multiple scales. So it's actually quite exciting because it's starting to maybe give some extra tools. So I'm just going to move to this next slide here. And here, this is what tends to happen when you start to talk about working in the community. The first thing everyone says is, have you done a needs assessment? Someone outside is going to make a needs assessment of them, as if that's what's really needed. But generally speaking, we have a fairly good idea of the needs, certainly within the resolution that's relevant. The question is, what's the gap in our knowledge at the higher level about what to do and how to relate to it? So as you can see, this is where there's a bit of a disconnect. We tend to have research which extracts out from individuals in the community, maybe social science research or other research that's around the dynamics of the community. And it's somehow sort of synthesized with what is thought to be happening at the program levels that have been rolled out and the types of societal systems. And it's synthesized at these higher levels, be it universities, research, etc. And that is what is seen at working at scale. The thing is, though, that there's this assumption that there's this smooth transition between the people in the community and these official bodies and institutions. However, we know that really nearly everything that's going to be recommended is going to be implemented via some organization. Now, for me, a lot of this work that's happened through our work doing international development with community development happened in South Africa, and we were working through a community-based organization. Okay, other instances, there might be larger scale communication campaigns working through municipalities. Whichever route it is, there will be some intermediate organizational taskscape. Now, some of that is hidden because we are using a lot of online platforms. So it kind of has enabled us to kind of feed directly into some of these platforms, and it becomes transparent, but we are still sitting in some sort of capacity that's been provided there. So what I've been really looking at is, as well as working in these areas and thinking about the synthesis and analysis, is how do we create real bottom-up community-driven practices? And in the strategic action area here, I'm just showing that there's that this is where we look to scale up a lot of the programs into systemic innovation or scale out into a region. But really, when you're getting into the community, the big challenge there, and often where you might need to really start, is to scale deep. And the metric is not as much in the community, the strategic action and how you get to that strategic action. That maybe if you then enter into that taskscape and become part of that, but in the daily living, we're working in contexts and we're looking for meaningfulness. And meaningfulness is a really useful kind of measure, because it's almost a sense of an affordance that can be there over time. It will yield, and that knowing is quite profound, and can start to give a sense of how we might be able to relate over longer time scales about where action is going to have impact. And it may not be possible to sort of synthesize and analyze that all at some scale or macro level. The meaningfulness of different approaches is often something that needs to be navigated at an actual landscape level. So I'm going to introduce some of the landscape work that I started doing with communities, but this work also now we've scaled that to create with Infusion a way of creating a kind of a landscape for the field of practice at the organizational level, or to bridge between sort of metaphors, the containers that those organizations create to work in. How do we start working with the metaphor landscapes and start to really hold in a much more granular textual kind of way to access complexity, which is not necessarily available when we reduce down into certain dimensions, which is what tends to happen with research that's present. So how to do that? So, well, one of the ways to try and address this is really tap into this enactive ecological spatial embodiment. Wow, what's that? Okay, so essentially speaking, what I'm talking about here is it's not all in your head. And it's not just the head happens to be embodied and we now realize it. And as Daniel mentioned, this is dynamical systems approach. Well, this dynamical system is actually how we are in the world. We interact, the mind, the nervous system, the body is acting and interacting with our environment. So how we do that and how we do that at scale is significant. Okay, so on the left here, we have more of a conceptual embodiment, which might be when we go up and our domains and we reflect on our domains and our higher level thinking, we're often in that conceptual embodiment. And it's not an accident, because if I want to take a perspective, I want to have a world view. If I want to have an insight, if I want to have foresight, they all involve the eyes. They all involve, and people think that the eyes are sensing what's out in the world. But as we know now from the way that we think about the dynamical systems, we are just receiving sensorial information which we're interpreting to make predictions about that world. And our eyes happen to be the vehicle which allows us to interact with the things the furthest away from us and to track things further away from us. So this is where I'm sort of bringing in that verticality there on the left with conceptual embodiment, but there's also, and at the same time, a level of biophysical embodiment, a kind of way that we are situated, and we can take our attention more into that at different times and really reflect on where we are, what it means. And we often talk about that deepening, a grounded theory being a big area in the social sciences. But you know, these areas, again, trying to relate them together. And we also, though, are acting in the world. So our key thing that we are is we're relating, we're doing, and we're doing that through the space around us. Okay, so with the sort of active inference approach of how cognition and how we are in the world, enacting the idea of this enactive ecological is we're enacting, and action is the central driver. Okay, where our concepts are physical, it's about how to act appropriately in the world. And we have, you know, a sense of how we can act and do things with objects, and we can relate to things. And in doing that, we have more recently, as we started to scale, we have this sense of self. Okay, so we talk about the individual, my sense of self, which is actually kind of a construct in a way that's sort of developed over the last 2,500 years. We are, and we have that sense of self. However, that sense of self can separate us from the world. Ultimately, we are in this dynamical system, and we're using some of these constructs to help us navigate what that is like spatially and within our niche. And that is where we are now. And one of the big things that's changed in our modern world is, whereas historically we would have been focused more on attuning to a natural terrain that was the hidden states of the world that we need to relate to, we're now much more about adapting to or constructing socio-technical environments. And so we that has changed how we relate to the world, and how we contain things. So I'm just going to bring that in there with, so this actually becomes one of the ways, which is also something that we're trying to, is how do we find some unifying multi-scale way of actually engaging what's going on for people at different scales, and reconfiguring these kind of landscapes to be more like what they might be based on how attention's being taken. Okay, so the landscape of concepts is different to the landscape of being in a park, not just as an obvious, but at a foundational level. So here we have this idea I've just mentioned, and I'm not going to go into the idea of peripersonal action fields, but it actually is it's a theory that actually can support a lot of this thinking. But essentially speaking, the main thing I want to show here is at the bottom, you've got the sense of self, relating and doing, that I just showed. And as we start to grow, and we can have groups, and those groups can relate and interact and have that mixing and blending that we want for community and to feel a community, we form teams, and those teams have specific containers that orientate us to purposeful action, strategic action. And we have an idea of what that is when we're in there. So that's often what onboarding to that sort of context means. And the challenge is that once you're onboarded to one context, it becomes like the water that you swim in. You don't notice until someone from another context tries to talk with you. And you have this challenge because your language is intricately related to how things are embodied. And you don't notice that when you've taken on your role, from the self into the role and the teleology that involves, be it a relational role, be it a more kind of objective role, you will spatially have a sense of how to act in your peripersonal space in relation to the extended ecological niche. And it's very clear when someone's in a very particular organization operational role, what that means. If I'm in a factory, it's fairly clear to be working in a factory. If I'm an artist going on a stage in traditional theatre and the audience comes in, there's a distinct relationship between the artist and their audience. Now, when you start doing participatory, interactive, immersive work, which is what you're looking at with a lot of the work to try and engage people around issues, those distinctions become blurred. You start to be connecting with people partly in their world. And the same question comes in for engineers. There's one thing being an engineer who's working on a water pump as a technological entity that's going to be manufactured. It's another thing if Engineers Without Borders is trying to engage engineers in water projects in Africa. They need to know the context because those contexts relate to how things are going to happen, but they may not, and they will not, know all about that context. They need to be able to admit that what is not present in their field of practice is going to be helped by other types of engagement. So this is a big area that can sort of come in, and this is what I'm hoping. So this idea of infusion space is like creating flexible ways to establish bridging spaces and experiences across levels of climate action across varieties of niche is something that this can bring to the table. As another way to sort of step to one side and maybe go into this kind of scale deep. and still be able to come back without it being some panpsychic kind of experience. And this really was developed through the work in South Africa, where we were working with school children initially around their experiences in their local area around HIV and healthy choices. We then worked with Oxfam Australia to develop the sociodrama topography process for water issues. And this is a group here that's been working, there's actually 25 participants, but they were sort of coming in and out in different stages, but they actually mapped with fabrics the sort of social topography, the emotional landscape, and the pink fabrics is their routes that they were taking to water. So they're starting to get an exploration and discovery of all the different types of stories, the types of ways people are relating to water access, sanitation and health. And the main thing to start there was that we value their experience, their understanding, and we want them to get that social landscape understanding, because that can inform, and they can then inform strategic conversations that make sense in that landscape. So this is not about them telling us the pressure of the water that should be used or the type of pump, but it's about telling us the stuff that there's gaps in higher levels of the system. And the higher levels of the system need to be able to say that, need to be able to admit that a lot of the problems is being able to say that you don't know something, not just doing a needs assessment of everyone at the local level. So this is the kind of idea that really takes us into this idea of scaling more generally. And when we look at a local ecosystem, so these are sort of three main areas that we're using in the aging dramatic change approach, is really looking at creating the community connections, and inspiring deep ways of understanding. So this is on the left is a group that's connecting and understanding and working with processes. Some of the people only spoke Farsi, some only spoke Spanish, some only spoke Mandarin in that group, yet they were able to use processes to understand their shared niche because they were all in the local geography of the same town of St. Catherine's. The middle one is working with community members with complex disability who are cognitively aware, but through their communication limitations through cerebral palsy, were not able to connect and communicate outside one-on-one with their devices. So we get to create a new process to look at that and to say that these, and then bring these together, and they formed a team. So now they became the first team of a community members with complex disability, actually, that we know of in the world, and they co-create dramatic stories and present them in front of audiences, and they're trying to develop a movement to scale that out to others. And then on the right is a forum theatre play, which was an interactive play for the Water Project, where the community were actually looking at reflecting and making sense of situations and thinking about more critically what kind of actions are happening and what could happen differently. And so all of this is going on at that local level. And the challenge then is, how does that then scale up to drive systemic innovation? Because most systemic innovation is really controlled by that organizational stroke kind of strategic institutional layers. And the key thing that underpins all of that is what's at the bottom here is generating an enriching capacity. So to support systemic innovation, in a way, much of this is about working on a different churn where we're really generating enriching capacity so that it can go there. So I'm going to go a bit quicker through these next slides, but this then does bring in whole questions of accessibility and this limit to our influence. So this is a sort of an adaptation of a slide from the International Development Research Council that they use for outcome mapping. But, you know, coming back to what Daniel was saying about accessibility, there's a limit to our influence. And when I say our influence, I mean our influence as systemic actors, maybe in organizations and in institutions. And again, this is where often what tends to happen is we try and get data, as shown here, that comes back to the policy research funding bodies that are shown here. And the inputs and activities that come in happen, but we have to note that our sphere of influence in relating to the outcomes of our activities is limited. And a lot of the impact, it may not be possible at all from the data that is just extracted to really do much meaningfully around actual action plans and actual changes to strategy. So this is the conundrum. So in accessibility, we need to accept the gaps in our knowledge across our socio-technical ecosystem. We need to own that as much as we need to enable communities to be engaged. Infusion Space, again, hopes to enable explorations of ambiguous states across multiple scales, thus bridging the local organisation and policy niches. So that's where that side of the practice is sort of coming in. And so in terms of participation and capturing the outcomes to infer impacts, there has been work done on this. Outcome mapping is one of the ones used. So here you can see that there's the communities and that they would look at boundary partners, people who've got common relationship to the areas of control or activities, the operations, and to try and connect that to some of the work that's with the leadership to make decisions. But there's still some gaps in terms of how this then relates to the funding bodies and the policy researchers. It's still being driven from above in many ways. So one of the things they've been looking at is with this participatory narrative sense making and the work with these landscapes to sort of complement that, maybe even a bit further out into the sort of community or into this kind of chaotic churn. How can that inform decision support just by scaling up principles through community-based operations research and social innovations? So this is the kind of space that we're sort of questioning. And so we want to connect systemic perspectives, which again, perspectives are about looking at things, okay? I can do that theoretically just with my head, although that's not actually possible. You need to be moving. But how do we connect that with other ways of knowing, embodied knowing, and obviously, like we said, more radically? So again, situating the awareness, we use some canvases to unpack that. So this would be the sort of canvas when we're really looking at grounding the cognition. Interaction is embedded in the relational sense. It's situated in terms of relating to people. It's situated in action, and the tools and the kind of the way that labour is divided in an environment. That is important to how our ability to engage is going to happen. So we can work with some of these methods to unpack that. And really sort of key thing is to sort of being able to adapt and respond and configure hopefully more types of complementary or even challenging or discomplementary activities together. So how can we adapt? Here's a situation from that water project. When that group carried on, the facilitation team that was running these workshops and going out and doing the 3-day workshops in the communities, we didn't know when we set this up. We knew they were going to different water catchment areas. We didn't know one of the water catchment areas would be in an island in the middle of a salt lake. So they couldn't drink any of this water. They're surrounded by water. They can't drink any of it. So this is the group here trying to access this before running the workshop, and they had to put their clothes in the buckets to make sure they didn't get wet. So and they were working on that project for a number of years. And so this idea of accessibility is, again, expands out once you really start to look at the, it's not just who's got permission, there's just the realities of the ecology, especially in sort of rural contexts or even peri-urban contexts. So developing processes that can connect across difference and abilities to engage hidden states of the world is vital. So in the same way, this is true with our group that becomes our mentors for the leadership team with disability and who use the alternative communication. They actually are now a leadership team that advise us on how to go and connect to other people because they would know far better than I could. And we develop through that these process innovations so that a group who are non-verbal can create together. So they use these shared artifacts and create these world building processes, which feeds back actually into the other processes for that can be used for infusion. So this is all a kind of a churn that sort of mixes together, but it's kind of exciting, and hopefully it can be found ways to integrate with the kind of online teams, with these all the different types of initiatives that are trying to work across complexity, granular, dynamical, all this type of work. So, and then we're back over to what would be potentially a very interesting breakout too. So how can groups of participants work with their own contextual experience, be that in the landscape of policy, be that in the landscapes of organizational work, be that in the landscape of community, to support climate change decision making? How can we get that existential sense making into the equation, the deep ways of knowing? And with that, I can bring us back to sort of what we were going to say is like a closing discussion, which would be how can teams using online platforms be part of exploring local embodied niches as a more broad thing? And maybe with that, I'll open that up to conversation.
Thank you very much, Stephen and Daniel. That's just fantastic expanding of the field of affordances for us to employ in trying to grapple with these complexity compounded on complexity that we deal with in the Collabathon. Folks want to have some Q&A now. We do have time.
Maybe Dorn, you could start with what you were just mentioning at the end, and we can kind of.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I have to jump off at 1:30, but I did want to just say thanks so much, to both of you. It was really entirely relevant, and I saw so many echoes of sort of what I feel like my own graduate work that I've been trying to translate into action within the Open Team network of sort of taking some of these concepts and applying it to agriculture, which I really think is sort of the embodiment of who, sort of the tools we're using in agriculture, a reflection of our understanding of the environment and how we can influence that in a really, it's sort of so fundamentally human in terms of how we work with the natural world. And so so a lot of what you're discussing really resonated with me in terms of how we work across from the microbiome to the, biogeochemistry and the biosphere and so forth, and transcending that, but it has to be translated into these local communities in local language, in social context, in accessible tools and technologies. And so we've been really trying to figure out what is the unifying, how do we create both those local communities of practice, and then access sort of this global knowledge base, or these knowledge utilities that can be translated into that. But it requires these, I think there are common technical elements to it, but that interface that needs to be sort of customized at the community level. So I'm really sort of curious in terms of your thinking in terms of, presenting this kind of complex data and accessible ways to have, environmental based community conversations. I mean, I think that's where we're coming at, is like, it's, data driven storytelling that we talk to each other, and how do we communicate in these ways to communicate again. So we collapse in nature. We observe ridiculous complexity every day, and yet we communicate in metaphors, we communicate in stories. We have all these other ways of sort of capturing that and relating it to our daily lives and decision making. So I feel like it's kind of a rambling comment, other than I really want to continue this conversation because it couldn't be more relevant as we go from taking off the shelf tools, using and building on top of project management and GitLab and versioning and things like that create those artifacts, but they're really been designed for software communities. And I feel like there's a lot of the core, architecture and social concepts and trust and agreement and artifact creation and conversation that's there, but has yet to be adapted to kind of this more general audience that's really involved in sort of experiencing the natural world, and how do we influence that? How do we apply some of these same sort of concepts of, these sort of knowledge utilities and common artifacts, and build on that. So again, thank you so much, but it's such a shame that I have to jump off in a few minutes, because I want to spend a lot more time with both of you on this.
Thanks for the comment. I'm going to start with that ag example, because it's actually very related to my context, which is in Davis, which is like an agricultural university. So here's what I just sort of captured from what you said. There's the multi-scale complexity, the microbiome and the ecological interactions and everything, and the price of corn and subsidies. It's like, how are we going to do anything? And the way to cut through the Gordian knot is we're not describers. we're policy selectors, we're agenda setters, we're goal setting, cybernetic entities, organizations, multi-scale. So we're looking for effective action. We're not trying to count angels on the head of a pin.
Exactly.
And then in the context of the communities, like Davis is interesting because there's Monsanto, of course, big ag, but also there's like an actual biweekly farmers market and community around that and a lot of local agriculture. And so the communities of practice in terms of how they deal with microbiome or how they deal with economics or research and development, it couldn't be more different. So what would it look like to develop the ontologies, narratives, formal documents, tools? How can we bring people together in a spirit of de-risking? Like, okay, wait, we're all using some type of pesticide intervention. Maybe there's a bright line here with this is illegal and this is legal for you or something like that. But like, how are we going to de-risk together in an interoperable way, whether we're having just small family apple farm or a Monsanto situation? And then what does the accessibility look like in terms of on-ramping people to that as a way of thinking? But people won't think that way until they see it real in the tools they use. But then people are using these fragmented, controlled tools, and that doesn't really breed the right type of thinking either.
Yeah, I would love to. Are you connected with some of the folks doing regen work there at Davis with like Kate Scow with or Jessica Chiardis?
Honestly, not. But if you or them, if you want to come do a Davis Complexity Group presentation, let's just do it.
Fantastic. So one of the things that's coming out on those, because we're actively creating some of these ontology work that is, and creating essentially a discussion a sort of a versioning process and sort of wizard for having even those ontology conversations, because often it's those terms in the context and that is so important about that term. And it requires facilitation to get over what's the underlying meaning, what's the intent, in the communication that's so important. And I think that's something where, again, tech-enabled, facilitated conversations where you actually have the artifact that comes out of that conversation that can be built on. And we're also seeing some work on the visual language to try to bridge some of those conversations to represent some of those complex systems concepts in icons in agriculture. And so something to bring up that I'd love to share and get both of your feedback on is they're building on the Noun project, but called Futicons. So developing science-based icons that represent complex concepts that we can then snap together in hexagons, again, rather than sort of honeycomb these rather than blocks. So it has sort of the bounds can be extended and they can also be nested. So I feel like that visual language that's accessible that can be applied on top of other data or images or other things that we use to describe is something that I'm particularly excited about right now. It's something
if I just chip in on that, because I think it's quite interesting. And another thing that might be as well with ontologies is often, so it's really valuable for scaling, but then there's also, how can we step outside of the ontology epistemology kind of focus, which is kind of what we do to organize and strategize the containers that allow us to have perspectives, is like action and interaction is the game, the main game in town. So the whole embodied experience and that kind of intersubjective knowing, if there's a landscape where that can be let to run out and maybe allow insights and knowing that's relating to a particular context to be meaningfully structured, then the question becomes, okay, how do we take some artifacts that are the most meaningful, the one that have the most meaningfulness, the ones that are going to give us the most affordance for decision support. We don't need to know all of it. It can be that it was a deep experience that was very enriching, but the thing that's really hard to normally tap into is this idea of meaningfulness, that kind of deep sense, because your cognition isn't necessarily able to go there, so it's to trust that, okay, and then can that integrate back into another type of ecosystem, which is more ontologically, So I think this is something I'm really interested in. One of the things we're looking at with a spatial activity that I've been doing to unpack people's immersive experience, one that I've done with school teachers and other things, is to actually take them and do a spatial activity outside or something. And we're looking at maybe even 3D scanning the space and overlaying different dimensional spatial landscapes based on their own feedback from doing explorations, and using that for the sense making or the sense finding. Sort of, you can almost make like a custom ontology for that group at that time and place. Doesn't necessarily have to be a global ontology, as long as you can take something meaningful and
link
translate
that
it back
to the common trunk. Yeah.
Yeah. So
Well, that's kind of like people take, you know, an inside joke or taking a group using a word in a certain way, but it's still an English word. If it's not part of the canon, you're going to have to reintroduce it every single time. If it's just a totally non sequitur interpretation of a word, you're going to confuse more than if you had used just another word. And so the language and the communication channels, and then the affordances that exist now in the socio-technical landscape are involved with remote teams having all formalizable operations. So previously, even if you had a camera in every angle of a room, you could never capture what happened in an in-person brainstorming session. But now you can have an online team with 3 deepfakes, 2 people working through an augmented translator, 11 participants, 2 facilitators, 1 person can be in 8 at once. Those are all new, and they can all be measured. You can do machine learning on all of that. How can all of that be brought to bear? How can we see those technologies as opportunities, not just constraints? Oh, there's lag, but we're connecting ag experts from different continents who have the same pest.
Yeah.
Okay, how do we focus on that second part with a connection for the people who don't want to be even hearing the word ontology and make that workable?
Well, it's really about interoperability and translation. Ontology is sort of the method for it, right? Is that sort of the function? So you communicate to the team cares about is translation or interoperability, right?
Yeah. And that's where
Oh, it's what your team cares about.
But our team, right, exactly. Yeah. See, well, I even like we have to be constantly putting ourselves in these different roles within the groups, right? So that on the larger level to code this, we actually do need all of that structure to be translated, and so we go from informal language into something that's more structured and part of it's part of, especially in ag, we have technical terms that it has to be translated across languages into something that's meaningful, that has units, that has measurable, whether it's social or environmental feedback. So, but you want to have the conversation in as little a structured way as possible to encourage that flexibility and creativity in that moment. So I think that's our balance here, right? Is to create those creative spaces, but then create these more firm artifacts that come out of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And as well as coming down with these firm artifacts, because often we're dropping things down into more production as we come from the idea to the operations to create something. Coming back up the other way can be important. So the question is what comes up the other way, because they're not necessarily going to just be producing stuff. And this is where it's interesting. I think at the top level with epistemology, it's meaning. What's this mean? What's meaningful when we make something, but what's the meaningfulness of something at a deep existential level? You know, that's what really drives a lot of stuff at the low, a meaningful
and continued participation and engagement and sort of that social connection and drive that why is so important.
And also you can
through that rough spot right at the beginning.
Yeah, and you can also extend that out to 50 years, 100 years. Like meaningfulness has an ability to extend temporal depth in a way that meaningful is kind of in the moment, or, to some extent, I have the experience of interconnection, but I'm willing to do some really unpleasant things if I think it's going to have a lot of meaningfulness for my community, or the world. The challenge, and that's really hard, and there's probably a lot of that. I think the big challenge with a lot of the people in the world is we spent the last 40 years in this modernistic, let's just build infrastructure way, and the world will be better. And I kind of believed that in the 80s. And then suddenly it's like that is actually killing us. So like we've got this deep existential clash between how to make the world better by just rolling out, you know, cars and exporting grain and feeding people that way, and realizing actually we have to think about how we are. It's not just a case of us constructing a better world. We actually have to find the meaningfulness to co-evolve with the world. And that's really challenging.
Well, but I mean, I think that's such an important insight, and we've kind of stumbled onto it with our communications with an open team. We start not by essentially the first statement is that agriculture is a shared human endeavor, and often followed up by similar to, say, deep space exploration, and yet this is a public science that can be applied in your backyard. It's something that in order to be useful, it needs to be applied, which means it needs to be translated to every single individual in every language and every spot on Earth. That's kind of an exciting challenge, but it also means it's the deep why, and now all the rest of it, you know, if you accept that, I think it's sort of kind of self-evident once you dive into it, but your sort of framing of that really resonated, because we didn't come out with that from a necessarily as the objective, but what we found is that was necessary to make to bring people into the community. That onboarding process and that North Star was really important, and we're still adapting it. I don't think that's necessarily the perfect way to do it, but I really think framing and creating language around that is so important for that sustained effort.
The visual part and the ontology help it be interlingual by default, instead of searching for adequate translations to concepts from the Western mind, which is a futile task. And just like you said, starting the meeting and everything with a shared narrative, you have to remind, you know, the superorganism what it is. Otherwise, it won't be even capable of carrying on action selection at that level of analysis. If people don't think that they're playing the right level, they're not going to play that way.
That's a good point.
But
and actually,
see you, Dor.
you probably got to go. So
yeah, thank you so much again. Thank you. I will. I'll ping you on both on the Discord, and we'll.
Yeah, thanks very much. I learned so much just listening to you guys now. It's brilliant. Thank you very much for coming, Dor.
Cheers.
Excellent. Cheers.
Nice. We're chilling. Well, it is us two, Tim, Tiberius,